Good morning. Thank you, Pastor Steve, and thank you to Stanley and Jamie for that beautiful music. Pastor Steve was right when he said we have a break from the norm, because I never considered myself normal. And so today it's my privilege to open the Word and talk to you. The last time I stood in this pulpit was the last day that we actually had church together in this building as a church family. And the title of my sermon then was All News is Good News. Those of you who memorize my sermons don't need to be reminded, for those who don't. I talked about the fact that good news tells us that life is going to get better. The stock market is going up, the weather is improving, and so on. Bad news is also good news, because as things deteriorate on planet Earth, it means that Jesus is coming soon, and the sooner we go to heaven, the better. So all news is good news. Today I want to talk about storms. In fact, I've titled my sermon Storm Opportunities. Did you know there are opportunities in storms? I've been through many storms. The first one that I remember in my mind was as a child at camp meeting in Indiana. All the tents were set up. There were large tents for the various meetings back in those days. Many people were in tents. There weren't near as many RVs as there are today. And you could almost count on a storm coming to campgrounds in Indiana. But this particular year, it was not just a storm, it was a tornado that ripped through the campgrounds and took those huge tents and just ripped them into shreds. The big poles were just bent in two as though you would break a matchstick. People's private tents were torn up. Do you know that no one lost their lives and no one was hurt in the storm? We lost the electricity. I remember being in this block, flat roof building with my parents when the storm hit, and we weren't in the direct path of the storm, but we saw what was going on, and outside the window, I remember our little car. It was a 63 Volkswagen. It was just sitting there shaking, ready to take off into orbit. And I looked up, and there was a sawhorse. You know, a sawhorse used for construction, way up in the air, flying around. I thought, wow, storms are powerful. I'll never forget that. Sometime later, actually not too far in the future from that, I remember the tornado season of 1965 in northern Indiana. President Johnson came and proclaimed it a national disaster. We lived in the heart of where the tornadoes hit. 141 people were killed in those tornadoes. It was the greatest natural disaster in Indiana history, even to this day. And some unusual things happened. There were huge tornadoes. One was a half a mile wide at the base. Perhaps you've seen pictures of narrow funnels and all the damage they do. Imagine a funnel a half a mile wide, totally ripping out whole communities. Well, there was one thing that I remember on Highway 31, going south from South Bend to Indianapolis. I remembered as a child because we rode that, we made that trip several times. There was a farm and it had a barn. And that barn was painted white. It had a hip roof, traditional old barn. Do you know that the tornado came down that path and took a hold of that barn roof and ripped it off at the weakest point, which was right where the walls meet the roof? And it turned that roof and dropped it at a 90-degree angle to where it had picked it up. And I would imagine that there was insurance involved, but a couple years later we saw two barns. The barn that lost its roof, they put a new roof on it. And the barn that was sitting, or the roof that was sitting over here, they jacked it up and put a foundation and walls. And to this day there are two barns. Storms are powerful. They're amazing. We moved to the Oregon coast And through the years, I've always tried to avoid paying rent, but not always successful. So I had this idea that if our family bought a new Airstream trailer, longest one they make, 34 feet, 3 axles, we could live in this, and we could be buying something rather than paying rent. So we lived in various RV parks there near Newport and Walport, Oregon, where I pastored. And I'll never forget one December. We were in an RV park right on the coast. In fact, 101 was to the east of us. We were between the highway and the ocean. And it was kind of up high, and you could walk over in the RV park and look down the bluff at the water churning against the rocks. It was beautiful. I loved the sound of that. But one night in December, the wind picked up. And we had major gusts. They were getting over 90 miles per hour. Can you imagine being in an Airstream trailer and having 90-mile-an-hour gusts in the middle of the night? I discovered as I analyzed the whole thing the next day that there was a reason why all of the trailers were facing east and west. Because as the wind came off the ocean, which it often did, it hit the front of the trailer. If any of the trailers in that RV park had been faced so that it hit the side, it would have flipped them over. Well, that was fearful. I remember the fear that night as that trailer shook. The next day we moved inland a couple miles and got away from that terrible wind. Storms give you a feeling of helplessness if you've ever been in a severe storm. I know here in California you have earthquakes rather than severe storms, but in the Midwest we had major storms. I remember one day in Pierce, South Dakota, I was spending the summer at home. My parents were up in the Black Hills because my father was the education leader and youth leader for the conference, and he ran the youth camp. And that summer I chose to be at home. And I was working on all of my antique car projects and everyone else's brakes and valve jobs and so on, so I was busy that summer. And one day the clouds rolled in and the wind began to blow and the rain came down and the storms beat against our house. And it rained so hard. My bedroom was down in the basement. There were these window wells along the side of the house for basement windows. And in a severe storm like this, when it was just raining and raining so hard, those window wells would fill up and the water would run into the basement. And so I decided to take a picture and go out and start bailing the water out of these holes, these windows. And I was doing that when all of a sudden it got calm. And I thought, that's kind of eerie. I know what that means. I looked around, and here was a funnel cloud coming right up the hill toward our house. It was several blocks away. But I was scared. What do? Do I stay in the basement? The house might fall into the basement. I decided to go get in a car and take off. And so there were 6 cars in the driveway. I was trying to think now which one is worth the most to save. And so finally I thought I better just take the one easiest to get into. I grabbed some keys, went and got in the car and took off. And by then it was so dark and the wind was blowing so hard I couldn't even see where the funnel was anymore. And I ended up going around the block, coming back home, running into the house and going down the basement and looking out that window to see what would happen. Sure enough, the tornado came by, ripping up everything in its path. About a block and a half from our house was as close as it got. Those are the kind of storms I don't like. There's that feeling of helplessness. We are not in control. Something might happen to us. The storm bears down on us. The Bible says that Jesus and the disciples were in a storm. Turn with me in your Bibles to Mark, the 4th chapter. Mark chapter 4, and I believe that we may have that on the screen in any moment. And here's the story about Jesus on the Sea of Galilee. And the story begins in verse 35 of Mark 4. It says, on that day, when evening had come, he said to them, let us go over to the other side. And leaving the multitude, they took him along with them. That's important. Whenever you enter a day of life, take Jesus with you. They took Jesus along with them, just as he was, in the boat, and other boats were with him. And there arose a fierce gale of wind, and the waves were breaking over the boat, so much that the boat was already filling up. And he himself was in the stern, asleep in the cushion. And they awoke him and said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? Think of that. Here's God in the boat in the storm. Don't you care? Have you ever felt that about God? God, do you not care what's going on in my life? The storms are pressing around me. I can do no more to resist. Do you not care? They said to Jesus, we are perishing. And being aroused, he rebuked the wind and said to the sea, Hush, be still. And the wind died down and became perfectly calm. And he said to them, Why are you so afraid? How is it that you have no faith? They became very much afraid. Notice their fear changed from the storm to Jesus. They became very much afraid and said to one another, Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? From this story we learn several things. Storms are opportunities, and there are 3 of them that I want to talk about today. The first opportunity is that the devil sees as an opportunity to destroy us. Here was the whole future Christian movement in one boat. Plus, there were other followers in other boats. If the devil could bring about a storm that would drown them all, he would get rid of the Messiah. He would get rid of the leaders of the infant Christian movement, and he would be done with the whole thing. The devil wants to destroy us, and he uses things to destroy us. Storms are opportunities, and storms in life. We've had this fearful thing, the coronavirus. The devil sees this as an opportunity to destroy God's people. The second opportunity was the opportunity that a storm provides to learn about ourselves. Did you realize that? You see, the Peter and James and John and many of the others were fishermen. They had spent their life on the Sea of Galilee. And on the Sea of Galilee, they had become good at what they did. They had been through many a storm. They were competent. Jesus was good at fishing, but now he was in their boat. And they were on the Sea of Galilee. This was their turf. Now they were in charge. They were competent, but they learned something about themselves that day. They ran into a storm like they'd never been in before. And they discovered that they, these mighty fishermen, much experience, were as vulnerable as anyone else on the Sea of Galilee. I've been on the Sea of Galilee in a boat, and our guide talked to us about how those mountains on both sides of the sea, how during the day it gets hot, and then in the evening up in the mountains, because the elevation, it cools down rapidly. And then, of course, the air is heavier, and it swiftly comes down from the mountains, and it hits the sea and churns the waters up. And this is what had happened. And they discovered that they were not as competent as they thought they were. Storms open our eyes to our vulnerabilities. We see our weaknesses. It's an opportunity to depend more on Jesus and recognize that we are not as strong as we thought we were. Back when I was a young pastor in Wisconsin, at workers' meetings and at camp meetings, sometimes all the pastors would play baseball or softball. I did not join them because I am bad at sports. My dad was a good ball player, and he tried so hard to get his son to play ball. And I couldn't hit the ball for anything. It would swing, the bat would swing under the ball. If I tried to catch the ball with my glove, it would more likely the ball would hit me in the face. And I just had a hard time, and so it was always very embarrassing when they said, "Oh, let's all go play ball." As a kid, at recess, if we were playing ball, I was the last one chosen. So I felt bad. I felt humiliated that I couldn't play ball. But after the ball game there, after camp meeting, all the pastors were coming back. Several of them were around the conference president. He was walking towards his car, and he was getting the keys to his car because he needed to go somewhere. And he discovered he didn't have the keys to his car. And I was observing this, though I hadn't played ball. And he came over, and sure enough, his keys he had locked in the car. There they were, hanging on the dash or on the column. And he wondered what to do. And now I was on my turf. I stepped up and I said, "What's the problem?" "Well, my keys are in the car." I said, "That's no problem. Does anyone have a hanger wire?" And someone found one and brought it over, and I bent the end, straightened the rest out, and this was a Buick, and that means it was a B-body General Motors car. I'd been inside those doors. I knew what the parts looked like. And so I put the wire down and moved it over and got a hold of what I knew that was there and pulled it up and opened his door for him. I felt better about myself. I couldn't play ball, but now we were on my turf. And these other guys couldn't do what I could do. See, the disciples were in their turf, but they were humbled that day because they couldn't handle the storm. God has a way of humbling us. Just recently, in fact, in the last year and a half, I had a problem with my four-wheel drive Suburban. And the problem was that the electronic buttons, it wouldn't go into four-wheel drive. And I had the dash apart because I had to fix something in the heater. When I put it together, the four-wheel drive just wouldn't work. Now I have pride when it comes to working on cars. I've never taken a car to a dealer, to a shop, and said, "I don't know what to do. Can you fix my car?" I've rebuilt automatic transmissions, rebuilt engines. When the car's in an accident, I do the body work, I paint it, I do the upholstery, I do it all, see. And I'm competent with cars. But I couldn't find the problem. And I thought, well, maybe it's that switch. So I ordered a switch, and I put a new switch in the dash, and it didn't make any difference. So I learned that there was a guy who, in the evenings, he would, for a certain amount of money, he would diagnose the problem. So he diagnosed the problem. He says, it's either this or that. And so one was a control motor that actually switches the transfer case, and I replaced it. It was quite a bit of money. I used original GM parts. That didn't make any difference. And so there was a control motor shifting the front axle, and I replaced it. Didn't make any difference. I took the entire transfer case off and took it all apart to see why it wouldn't shift, and it was in good condition. I replaced the control module under the dash, the computer, the brain, and it didn't make any difference. And finally, and I prayed about these things. I said, Lord, I'm a mechanic. I can't figure this out. Finally, I put my tail between my legs, and I went down to the Chevrolet garage. I told them my problem. They said, well, we'll look at it. And so I left it there, and I came back the next day, and yes, they had fixed the problem. It took them 4 hours. Do you know how much it cost per hour? Well, I said, what was the problem? They said, well, it took us quite a while to diagnose the problem, but the problem was that the plug in the switch in the dash had one little wire pulled out of its, in the plug. One wire was pulled out. It needed to be pushed back in. That was free, see. I spent no less than $1,000 replacing parts. They felt so bad for me, they only charged me for 2 hours. As a mechanic, that was humbling. The disciples were competent fishermen. They'd been in boats all their lives. Now a storm hit and they felt totally helpless. Have you ever felt helpless in your life? When everything was against you and things that you thought you had in control Perhaps your marriage, you thought it was solid, but now it's coming apart. Perhaps your temper, you thought it was under control, and now you lost it, and you embarrassed yourself. So many ways that the devil has to destroy us and humble us. Psalm 107, verses 27 and 28. Psalm 107, verses 27 and 28 says this. I'm starting in verse 23. Those who go down to the sea in ships. Verse 24, they have seen the works of the Lord. Verse 25, he spoke and raised up a stormy wind. Verse 27, they reeled and staggered like drunken men. They were at their wits' end. Have you ever been at your wits' end? I have. Storms take us to our wits' end. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distresses. What a special verse. We come to our wits' end. We cry to the Lord. Finally we cry is what it's saying. We've been relying on ourselves so long, but finally we can do nothing more, and we cry out to God, and he delivers us from our distress. Third opportunity. So the first is the opportunity for the devil to try to destroy us. The second opportunity is that we learn more about ourselves. The third opportunity is for God to deliver and build our faith through his power. In that 1965 tornado, there was a tornado that seemed to almost be following the path of the road. It was east and west. And as it followed the road, it destroyed everything on both sides. It was a large funnel. And it came along, and there was one of the homes of a member in our church. What did the tornado do? It all of a sudden popped up. People that were watching actually saw this happen. It lifted off the ground. It actually took their garage roof off. Totally did not touch their house. And then it stayed up in the air because the next thing in line was the Krupp mobile home factory. We had ordered a mobile home because my father had joined the evangelistic team. We were going to be moving every 2 months. And so we had to have a special trailer, special built so it wouldn't sag and bust apart. It had just been finished. They'd parked it in the lot for a final inspection. The tornado came along, and there was that trailer, our trailer, and it lifted up off these members' home and didn't touch it. It stayed up in the air above that trailer manufacturing, went down on the other side, and continued its destruction. The next thing it hit was a mobile home park. I'll never forget it. I saw it the next day. All of them were destroyed. One mobile home had no walls, roof, or anything, and it was laying in the creek. Another one was broken in a large tree. They were totally destroyed. And the tornado kept going on its path. Storms are opportunities for God to deliver his people and show his strength and build our faith. God uses storms to build our faith and trust. The best thing the disciples did that day was to take Jesus into the boat. Can you imagine? Here's Jesus in the boat. Here comes this storm. Jesus is asleep. And the disciples, what are we going to do? They were bailing water as fast as they could, but they couldn't keep up. But Jesus was in the boat. Somehow they forgot that. Somehow they didn't realize that if the boat sank, the Son of God was going down too. And so as we face life every day, the best thing to do is to take Jesus into our boat. We start out the day by inviting Jesus into our lives. Nothing can happen to us if Jesus is invited to come along. Nothing can happen to us except that he allows it. They took Jesus into the boat. John the 16th chapter and verse 33. Can't remember why I have that, but I think we will find out here in just a moment. John 16 and verse 33 says this, "These things I have spoken to you, that in me you may have peace." We want peace, don't we? "In the world you will have tribulation or trouble, but take courage, I have overcome the world." Take Jesus every day into the boat with you, into your life. It's a promise we will have trouble, but it's also a promise that Jesus will be with us and never forsake us. Notice back in Mark, the 4th chapter, where we were reading the story. Let's look at something interesting. I believe it's in verse 40 or 41. It's in verse 40. Jesus said to them, "Why are you afraid? How is it that you have no faith?" You see, fear, extreme fear, and faith are mutually exclusive. Either we have faith, which overcomes our fears, or we have fears that overcome our faith. And Jesus said, "Why is it that you're afraid? How is it that you don't have faith?" We've all been through a storm here in America and around the world. In fact, it's still with us. The coronavirus storm is still blowing. I've learned something as I've analyzed what's been going on in the world and in the lives of friends around me. I've discovered 3 kinds of faith. The first kind of faith, I call them the bailers. They're doing everything they can to avoid the trouble. The disciples were bailing the water out. And today there are many bailers. They're doing everything that they can and more to cope with the problem. They're fearful that they might get the virus and die. They believe that their survival depends on who? Them. Their motto is, "God helps those who help themselves." I'm going to do whatever it takes to stay alive. I call them bailers. And by the way, if you identify with that, don't lose heart, because that's where the disciples were, handpicked by Jesus. They turned the world upside down later on. They began the Christian movement. But at one point in their life, though they were Christ followers, they were bailers. Second class are the presumptors. The presumptors. God will see me through this. Nothing can happen to me bad because God has promised protection. Their favorite verses, one of them is James 1, verse 6 and 7. James 1, verses 6 and 7, where it says, "But let him ask in faith without any doubting, for the one who doubts is like the surf of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. Let not that man expect that he will receive anything from the Lord." So there are many Christians say, "I don't want to be a doubter. I want to remove all doubt from my mind, and if I can do that, God will come through for me." One of their other favorite verses is where it says the prayer of the righteous. I think it's James 5. 15, it says, "The prayer offered in faith will restore the one who is sick, and the Lord will raise him up," and so on. And they claim these promises. And by the way, whenever you want to learn something from the Bible to establish a doctrine or a teaching or a belief, you look at what the entire Bible has to say on the subject. Don't extract certain verses that are to our liking. We tend to do that. But there's other verses. One of them, Jesus said, "If it be thy will, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, thy will be done." Jesus himself submitted to his Father's will. My wife's mother passed away a number of years ago. She had a brain tumor, and it was rapid. When it was discovered, it was quite advanced. There was some brain surgery done, but there was little hope, and she passed away. She was in Florida. We were in Oregon. Debbie was teaching school. There was very little opportunity for Debbie to get back and talk to her mother before she died. But when she did go back, she wanted to talk to her mother, who was obviously dying, about death. She wanted to talk to her about heaven. What a wonderful place it is, and we'll be together. Her mother refused to talk about death, refused to talk about heaven. She was a believer, a Christian. But she believed that she would be healed if she willed that she would be healed. And if she got rid of all doubt, God would heal her. She never took the opportunity to talk about heaven. It's a mistaken belief that somehow if we can just push all doubt aside, God will have to deliver us. So there's that second kind of faith. The third kind of faith is what I call great faith. David had great faith. Let's turn to Psalm, the 31st chapter, verses 14 and 15. Psalm 34. Was that it? Psalm 31. Psalm 31, verses 14 and 15. David said, "But as for me, I trust in thee, O Lord. I say, thou art my God. My times," notice that, "my times are in thy hand." David recognized that his times, his life, the timetable of birth and death were in God's hands. And the Bible affirms that in Acts the 13th chapter and verse 36. Acts 13 and verse 36 says this, speaking of David, it says, "For David, after he had served the purpose of God in his own generation," notice, after he had served God's purpose in his own generation, "he fell asleep and was laid among his fathers and underwent decay." God has a purpose for every person. Do you know that if you've surrendered your heart to God, if you invite Him into the boat, into your life, He has a purpose for you. And it doesn't matter what virus is going around, it doesn't matter what crazy driver is on the highway, it doesn't matter. If your purpose is not over, God will not allow you to die, according to the Bible. We are in His care. We are in His hands. Nothing can happen to us except that God wills it. Now, there were those who recognized this. Gideon was one. Joshua, the 14th chapter and verse 12. Joshua 14 and verse 12. Gideon was one who was a brave and mighty, very faithful warrior. He had total trust in God. But notice what he says. After they'd gone in and taken the promised land, and of course Caleb and Joshua were the only two that left Egypt that actually entered the promised land. All the others were born in the wilderness, except for those who were children at the time. It says, "Now then, give me this hill country about which the Lord spoke on that day. For you heard on that day that the Anakim," those were giants, "were there with great fortified cities. Perhaps the Lord will be with me." Did you know Caleb said that? He didn't demand that God be with him. He said, perhaps. "Perhaps the Lord will be with me, and I shall drive them out as the Lord has spoken." The words of Caleb. You see, Caleb had faith in God. He knew that if God had a purpose continuing for his life, that he would be successful in doing what he was setting out to do. He had great faith. Jonathan had the same faith. 1 Samuel 14 and verse 6. Jonathan, the close friend of David. We don't have too many stories about him in the Bible, but there was one point where their enemies had taken all of their weapons. No one had a weapon except Jonathan and his father Saul, the king. And Jonathan told his armor bearer these words. Verse 6, then Jonathan said to the young men who was carrying his armor, come, let us cross over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. Perhaps the Lord will work for us, for the Lord is not restrained to save by many or few. Those with great faith don't demand of God, but nor do they think that it's all up to them. Instead, they know that their lives, their times are in God's hand, and they conduct their lives accordingly with great faith. Daniel, the 3rd chapter, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were threatened by the fiery furnace in chapter 3, verses 17 and 18. If it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods, and so on. You see, great faith not only has faith in God's abilities, it has faith in God's wisdom, and it trusts God's timetable. Great faith does. It doesn't demand of God, nor does it sit around thinking that it's all up to me to survive the storm. No, my times are in God's hand. I will fulfill God's purpose for me in this life. If I'm not done fulfilling that purpose, nothing will happen to me. If I'm done, something might happen to me. You see, it's in God's hands, and that's great faith. God has a purpose for us. We should be confident that whatever does or doesn't happen to us is in God's hands. 2 men were on an island, stranded. No one knew they were there. Their boat had been wrecked, and they got to this island. And the one man said, we're going to die, there's no food, no water, we're going to die. The second man was leaning up against a palm tree so calmly that it drove the first man crazy. Don't you understand? We're going to die. Second man replied, you just don't understand. I make $100,000 a week. First man looked at him quite dumbfounded and asked, what difference does that make? How will your money help us? We're on an island with no food and water. We're going to die. We're going to die. Second man answered, you just don't get it. I make $100,000 a week. I give 10% to my church every week. My pastor will find me. You see, if God has not completely fulfilled his purpose for our lives, and if we are submitted to him, we are in his hands. Nothing can happen to us except that God allows it. Now, you might get discouraged and say, I sound like I'm a bailer. I don't have enough faith. I'm so afraid during this coronavirus. I'm home all the time. I wear a mask even at home. Take courage. The disciples were bailers. Take courage. Before Jesus comes, the prophecy of the 10 virgins will be fulfilled. All of them were asleep. 5 were foolish, 5 were wise. The wise were asleep. You see, God saves people not because they're perfect in their trust and faith. He saves them because their heart desires him, and they trust him. And like the man in the Bible who said, Lord, I believe, help me where I don't. See, an attitude of sincerity. An attitude of willingness to allow God to build our faith. In conclusion, storms will come. Satan will seek opportunity to destroy us. We will be humbled as the storms are too much for us. But God will never allow anything to happen to us outside of his will. In closing, I want to read Romans 8:38 through 39. Romans 8:38 through 39. It says, for I am convinced that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor any other created thing shall be able to separate us from the love of God which is in Christ Jesus our Lord. We have no reason to fear if we have great faith And we know that Jesus, because we've submitted our lives to Him, and He is in the boat with us, and we've invited Him daily into our lives, we have no reason to fear. Coronavirus can do whatever it wants to do, but it will not touch God's people if His purpose for us is not finished. Let's sing about it. Anywhere with Jesus, I can safely go.